At 6:17 a.m. local time on March 22, 2026, a satellite operator working the night shift inside Aramco's surveillance center in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, saw two signatures moving across his screen. They were fast, they were low, and they were heading straight toward the biggest oil refinery in the kingdom. Within 90 seconds, Saudi air defense batteries locked on. Two Iranian-made drones, launched from somewhere inside Iran's western corridor, were intercepted just short of the Ras Tanura complex on the Persian Gulf coast. The interception was a success, but what fell from the sky was not. Burning debris from both drones rained down across the refinery perimeter. A fire broke out. Thick black smoke poured into the morning sky, visible from 30 kilometers away. Videos flooded social media within minutes. And before the sun had fully risen over the Gulf, the most important refinery in the Middle East went dark. Here's what nobody is telling you about what happened next. Ras Tanura is not just a refinery, it is the beating heart of Saudi Arabia's oil export machine. The complex processes 550,000 barrels of crude oil every single day. It sits right on the Gulf Coast, connected to the world's largest conventional oil field at Ghawar. And it draws extra crude from Abqaiq and Khurais. The terminal attached to it handles a staggering share of Saudi crude exports, with tankers leaving for China, Japan, South Korea, and Europe on a near-continuous rotation. When Aramco shut it down that morning, they called it a precautionary measure. They said the damage was limited. They said there were no casualties. All of that was technically true, but the shutdown was not about the fire. The shutdown was about fear, because Ras Tanura was not the only target that morning, and those two drones were not the only ones Iran launched. On the same day, Iranian drones struck Abu Dhabi's Masafah fuel terminal. They hit the Fujairah oil terminal on the eastern UAE coast. They targeted Qatar Energy's Ras Laffan facility, the single largest liquefied natural gas complex on Earth. Qatar produces nearly 20% of the world's LNG exports. By Tuesday, Qatar Energy had halted production entirely. By Wednesday, they declared force majeure on gas contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. Signal number one. This was not a single strike. This was a coordinated assault on the entire energy infrastructure of the Persian Gulf. And it worked. Within hours, Brent crude surged 10%. By the end of Monday, it was trading at $79 a barrel. That was just the beginning. Within a week, it would touch $120. And by Thursday, March 12th, Brent closed above $100 for the first time since August 2022, after Iran's new supreme leader made a statement that sent shockwaves through every trading floor on the planet. But we will get to that statement, because to understand why that statement changed everything, you first have to understand the man who made it, and the fact that almost nobody has actually seen him since the war began. Let us rewind 48 hours before the Ras Tanura strike. On the night of February 28, 2026, Operation Epic Fury began. The United States and Israel launched a devastating joint military campaign against Iran. The opening salvo targeted Iran's leadership, military infrastructure, and nuclear facilities. Among the first targets hit was a compound in Tehran housing Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. The strike killed him. It also killed his wife, his sister, and several family members. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was reportedly in the same compound. He survived, but intelligence reports suggest he did not escape unscathed. Israeli sources believe he was wounded. There were rumors of a coma, reports of an amputated leg. Iranian officials acknowledged he was injured but insisted he was alive and well. Here is what is extraordinary. Mojtaba Khamenei was appointed Iran's new supreme leader on March 9th by the Assembly of Experts. He has not appeared in public since not once. No video, no audio, no photograph taken after February 28th. When his first public statement was broadcast on March 12th, it was read by a state television news anchor. While a still photograph of Khamenei was shown on the screen, a 56-year-old man now commands one of the most powerful military machines in the Middle East. He controls the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. He commands a navy that has effectively shut down the most important oil choke point on Earth, and no one outside Tehran's inner circle can confirm whether he is operating from a hospital bed. That is the person who just declared that the Strait of Hormuz will remain closed indefinitely. But here's the catch. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway, it is the single most important maritime corridor for global energy trade. In 2025, an average of 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products pass through it every single day. That represents roughly 25% of the world's entire seaborne oil trade. Approximately 80 million tons of liquefied natural gas pass through it annually. China received a third of its oil imports through this strait. Japan received 70% of its crude through tankers that crossed it. Europe depended on it for 12 to 14% of its LNG supply. Before February 28th, those tankers moved freely. After February 28th, they stopped. On the first day of the war, tanker traffic through Hormuz began to collapse. By March 1st and 2nd, 0 commercial ships appeared in the strait, not one. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued direct warnings prohibiting vessel passage. Maersk, the world's largest container shipping company, suspended all transits. Hapag-Lloyd followed, CMA-CGM followed, MSC followed. Every major container shipping line on the planet pulled out of the Persian Gulf within 72 hours. By March 6th, more than 400 tankers were stranded inside the Gulf, their owners refusing to authorize movement. By March 8th, only 2 outbound transits were recorded through the strait, and both vessels were Iranian flagged. By March 9th, just 1 ship passed through, also Iranian. By March 13th, Bloomberg's vessel tracking data confirmed 0 confirmed transits in either direction over the prior 24 hours. Traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had not merely declined, it had ceased to exist, and Iran was enforcing the closure with violence. Between February 28th and March 11th, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Center documented 17 incidents affecting vessels operating in and around the strait. 13 of those were confirmed attacks. 3 ships were struck off the coast of Iran on March 11th alone. The Thailand-flagged bulk carrier Mayuri Nari was hit by Iranian projectiles just 11 nautical miles north of Oman. The strike triggered an engine room fire that disabled the vessel. 3 crew members were initially reported missing. The One Majesty and the Star Winneth were also struck the same day. An Iranian armed forces spokesperson made the regime's position explicit. Not 1 liter of oil would be allowed to pass through the Strait of Hormuz for the benefit of the United States and its allies. And then came the threat of mines. Reports emerged that Iran was preparing to deploy naval mines inside the strait. Mining the waterway would not just scare shipping away, it would physically stop it. A single mine can disable or sink a supertanker. Hundreds of mines scattered across the shipping lanes would close the strait, not for days, but for months. President Trump said the United States had destroyed 28 Iranian vessels capable of laying mines. U.S. Central Command posted video of attacks on multiple Iranian naval vessels, but the threat persisted. Energy Secretary Chris Wright admitted on March 12th that the U.S. Navy was not ready to escort tankers through the strait. The military's focus, he said, remained on destroying Iran's offensive capabilities, not on reopening the waterway. That is where the global economy began to crack. Here is the chain reaction. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply disappears from the market overnight. When that happens, refineries from Tokyo to Rotterdam begin running out of feedstock. When refineries slow down, diesel production drops, jet fuel production drops, gasoline production drops, petrochemical feedstock production drops. And then the second-order effects begin. Approximately 1/3 of global fertilizer trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Urea prices at the New Orleans hub jumped from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton in under 2 weeks. That is a 43% spike, hitting right in the middle of the American spring planting window for corn and soybeans. Aluminum futures climbed, as the region accounts for nearly 10% of global primary aluminum production and 18% of seaborne iron ore pellet exports. About 85% of polyethylene exports from the Middle East flow through Hormuz, feeding packaging, automotive components, and consumer goods worldwide. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not a political statement, a mathematical one. They estimated global supply could fall by 8 million barrels per day in March alone. On March 11th, the IEA's 32-member countries unanimously agreed to release 400 million barrels from their emergency reserves. It was the largest coordinated reserve release in the IEA's 52-year history, dwarfing the 182 million barrels released after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The United States committed 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Japan announced releases starting March 16th. The United Kingdom pledged 13.5 million barrels. South Korea committed 22.46 million barrels. Germany and Austria began releasing their own stocks. The market did not care. On March 12th, Brent crude gained 9.22% in a single session. It closed at $100.46 per barrel, the first time above $100 since August 2022. West Texas Intermediate surged 9.72% to settle at 95.73. The IEA's massive intervention had been completely overshadowed by a single statement from a man no one has seen. Mojtaba Khamenei's televised message, read by someone else, declared that the lever of blocking the Strait of Hormuz must definitely continue to be used. He demanded all U.S. military bases in the Middle East close immediately or face attack. He warned that studies had been conducted on opening other fronts in which the enemy has little experience and will be extremely vulnerable. Analysts at Dutch bank ING summed it up with brutal clarity. The only way to see oil prices trade lower on a sustained basis, they wrote, is by getting oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. Failing to do so means the market highs are still ahead of us. But here's the catch. Saudi Arabia had a backup plan, and it was 40 years old. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when tankers were being attacked in the Gulf with terrifying regularity, Saudi Arabia built something extraordinary. A 750-mile pipeline stretching from the Abqaiq oil processing facility on the kingdom's eastern coast all the way across the Arabian Desert to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. They called it the East-West Pipeline. Most people know it as the Petroline. For decades, parts of it had been converted to carry natural gas. It was underused, almost forgotten. Then on March 2nd, the same day the Ras Tanura refinery went dark, Aramco began pumping crude west. By March 10th, Aramco CEO Amin Nasser announced on the company's earnings call that the pipeline would hit its full emergency capacity of 7 million barrels per day within days. The full capacity was achieved on March 11th. Yanbu, a Red Sea port that had been handling fewer than 800,000 barrels daily in February, saw its throughput triple in barely a week. By early March, loadings averaged 2.2 to 2.5 million barrels per day, a 330% surge compared to pre-war levels. 27 very large crude carriers were heading toward Yanbu. India's Reliance Industries had already chartered supertankers. South Korean refiners were booking late March slots. Saudi Arabia was not just rerouting its oil, it was redrawing the entire energy geography of the Middle East in real time. But there was a problem hidden inside the solution. Every barrel loaded at Yanbu has to sail south through the Red Sea. Every tanker has to pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow waterway between Yemen and the Horn of Africa. And on February 28th, the same day the war began, Houthi-controlled Yemen announced it would resume attacks on Israeli and commercial ships transiting the Red Sea. The Houthis had spent the previous 2 years turning that waterway into a gauntlet. Missile strikes, drone attacks, and small arms engagements on commercial vessels had forced major shipping lines to reroute around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks and billions of dollars to transit times. The return of Houthi attacks meant that Saudi Arabia's escape route ran straight through a second war zone. As one analyst at the Center for the National Interest put it, the shift to the Red Sea made the Houthis important all over again. All the infrastructure was still exposed to drones, and the oil leaving Yanbu bound for Asia had to pass through the Bab el-Mandeb. The pipeline could not replace Hormuz, not fully. Yanbu's 2 terminals had a combined loading capacity of roughly 4.5 million barrels per day. Before the war, Aramco was exporting approximately 6 million barrels daily through the Strait of Hormuz alone. Even at maximum capacity, the Red Sea route left a gap of at least 1.5 million barrels per day. And that calculation did not account for Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE, whose exports through Hormuz had collapsed entirely. Iraq reported 0 oil and commercial vessel entries into its ports after the strait closed. Kuwait declared force majeure after domestic storage hit capacity. Bahrain's Bapco refinery on Sitra Island was struck by an Iranian drone on March 9th. The United Arab Emirates shut its Ruwais refinery, one of the world's largest, after a fire from a drone strike. Production across the Gulf region was being shut in at a staggering rate. Saudi Arabia alone curtailed approximately 2 to 2.5 million barrels per day of offshore production from fields including Safaniya, Marjan, Zuluf, and Abu Safa, representing roughly 20% of national output, not because the fields were damaged, but because there was nowhere to put the oil. The global economy was watching a slow-motion heart attack in the world's most critical energy artery, and the stock market felt every beat. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 739 points on March 12th alone, falling 1.56%. The S&P 500 sank 1.52%. The Nasdaq Composite fell 1.78%. Asian markets slumped on March 13th, poised for a second straight weekly decline. India's Sensex dropped over 800 points in a single session, as oil's rally sparked what traders called a bloodbath on Dalal Street. The European Union warned that inflation could surpass 3% if Brent remained near $100 per barrel. And the February U.S. jobs report had already shown the economy losing 92,000 jobs before the war's inflationary shock had even begun to show up. Here is what the market was pricing in. Not a temporary disruption, not a clears-throat brief skirmish. The market was pricing in a prolonged siege of the world's energy supply. Macquarie, the investment and advisory firm, said it plainly. Strategic reserves are not a permanent solution. Crude oil will continue to trade like a meme stock until the solution is peace. But peace was nowhere in sight. The G7 nations agreed on March 11th to explore the possibility of escorting commercial ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Energy Secretary Wright said on March 12th that the U.S. Navy might be able to start escorts by the end of March. But even if they could protect every tanker, they could not protect against mines. They could not guarantee insurance companies would underwrite the voyages. They could not force crews to sail into a war zone. Under international maritime law, crews have the right to refuse to enter combat areas. Insurance companies were making coverage decisions on a ship-by-ship basis. Premiums had skyrocketed, and even the handful of independent operators willing to brave the crossing were charging $500,000 per day in hazard premiums. As one shipping executive in Hong Kong put it, if you are willing to do it, you might get paid enormous sums, but there is obviously a profound risk in it. The only vessels still moving through Hormuz with any regularity were the Shadow Fleet. Ships carrying sanctioned oil from Iran, Russia, and Venezuela. Vessels operating with their transponders turned off, invisible to tracking systems, moving through the most dangerous waterway on the planet under cover of electronic silence. Iran's own tankers continued to carry crude to China, generating revenue for the regime, even as it strangled global trade. Iran's new supreme leader had stumbled onto the most devastating economic weapon in modern geopolitics. Not a nuclear bomb, not a conventional army, just a narrow waterway and the willingness to use it. Consider what a single week of this closure has already produced. Oil above $100 a barrel, the largest emergency reserve release in history. Global fertilizer prices spiking before planting season. Aluminum futures climbing. Polyethylene supply chains cracking. LNG prices at 3-year highs. European diesel and jet fuel facing shortages. More than 400 tankers stranded. Global maritime shipping rerouted around an entire continent. Stock markets bleeding in every major economy. Central banks scrambling to reassess inflation forecasts that were obsolete before the ink dried. And Mojtaba Khamenei, from wherever he is, whichever hospital or bunker or undisclosed location houses a wounded 56-year-old cleric who now commands the IRGC, had one more card to play. His statement mentioned new fronts, areas where the enemy had little experience, areas where the United States would be extremely vulnerable. That was not rhetoric. That was a threat matrix. Iran's proxy network spans Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Hezbollah launched approximately 200 rockets into Israel on the night of March 12th alone. Houthi forces were repositioning to interdict Red Sea traffic. Iraqi militias were signaling readiness to join the fight. The war was not shrinking, it was expanding. The question is no longer whether this conflict will disrupt global trade, it already has. The disruption is total. The Strait of Hormuz has not just been choked, it has been eliminated from the global supply chain. And the alternatives, Yanbu, Fujairah, the Cape of Good Hope, the Suez Canal, are all either insufficient, vulnerable, or both. The question now is, how long? If the strait reopens within weeks, the damage is severe but recoverable. Oil falls back below $80. Markets stabilize. Supply chains recalibrate. Emergency reserves are replenished over the following year. The world exhales. If the strait remains closed for months, the damage becomes structural. Refineries close permanently. Petrochemical plants relocate. Trade routes solidify around new patterns. Inflation embeds itself into the global economy. Developing nations face food crises as fertilizer prices push agricultural inputs beyond reach. Energy-dependent economies in South Asia and East Africa face power shortages. The global GDP contraction could exceed anything seen since 2008. Two futures, two paths. And the deciding factor is a man nobody has seen, ruling from a country under bombardment, commanding forces across half a continent, holding the global economy hostage through a strait that is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Ras Tanura was not the beginning, it was the announcement. A flaming refinery on the Saudi coast was Iran's message to the world. You depend on us. Whether you admit it or not, your economies, your industries, your grocery stores, your gas stations, your airline tickets, your heating bills. They all pass through a corridor that we control, and right now, that corridor is closed. The next 72 hours will determine whether this becomes the worst energy crisis since 1973 or something far worse, whether diplomacy finds a foothold, or whether the shadow of mines across the Strait of Hormuz becomes a reality that reshapes global trade for a generation. Watch the Strait, watch the tanker counts, watch the insurance markets. Watch whether Mojtaba Khamenei appears on camera, or whether his regime continues to broadcast photographs of a ghost, because whatever happens next begins there, in that narrow channel of water between Iran and Oman, where 20 million barrels a day used to flow and where today, as of this morning, Friday, March 13, 2026, the number is 0.